She was 19 years old, standing on a wooden platform in the middle of a dying town, and not a single person in that crowd was going to save her. Every child before her had been chosen. Every one. The little ones went first, always did. Then the teenagers who looked strong enough to work a field or scrub a floor without complaining. One by one, hands were raised, coins changed hands, and lives were decided in the span of a few cold seconds. Then came Elena Cross, and the crowd went quiet in a way that felt like a verdict. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be the last one left, the one nobody wants, stay with me. Because this story is about to show you exactly what happens when the world decides you're worthless, and one man decides the world is wrong. Watch until the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Elena Cross turned 19, she got a cracked bowl of cold oatmeal and a notice that said she had 30 days to vacate the Holloway home for orphaned youth. She remembered sitting at the long wooden table in the dining hall, staring at that paper, while around her the younger kids ate and argued and knocked over their cups. Nobody told her happy birthday. Nobody even looked at her. She folded the notice into a small square, tucked it into the waistband of her skirt, and ate her oatmeal standing up because someone had taken her chair. That was 6 weeks ago. Now she stood on a platform in the center of Red Hollow, Colorado, wearing every piece of clothing she owned, which amounted to a faded wool dress, a coat with 2 missing buttons, and boots that let the cold in through a split along the left sole. The sky above was the color of old pewter. The mountains in the distance were already white at the peaks, and down here in the valley, the wind had an edge to it that sliced right through wool and cotton and bone. Red Hollow was not the kind of town people chose. It was the kind of town people ended up in. Miners came here chasing silver and copper rumors, dragging their families behind them, and then the mine would go dry or cave in or just stop being profitable. And half of them would leave and half of them would stay because they had nowhere else to go and no money left to get there. What remained was a town of stubborn people and failed dreams, of saloons that stayed busy because the alternative was thinking too hard, of mud streets and wooden storefronts with faded paint and broken windows patched with oilskin. The platform in the center of town wasn't built for auctions. It was built for announcements and the occasional public hanging. But the territorial administrator had decided that Red Hollow, with its desperate labor shortage and its proximity to the mining operations up the mountain, was a reasonable place to hold a labor placement drive. That was the official term. Labor placement. Everyone in the crowd knew what it actually was. 23 young people had stood on that platform since morning. 23. Elena had watched from the holding area, a roped-off section behind the general store, as they were called up one by one, described by the administrator in terms that made them sound like livestock at a county fair, and then purchased by whoever raised a hand first and fast enough. Strong arms, good teeth, no known diseases. Experienced with kitchen work, quick learner. That was how they talked about people here. Quick learner, good teeth. She had watched Thomas, who was 17 and broad-shouldered, get taken by a mining operation foreman within 10 seconds. She had watched little Clara, who was 8 and still sucked her thumb when she thought no one was looking, get scooped up by a farming family who looked decent enough that Elena had actually felt something close to relief. She had watched a group of 4 siblings, ages 9 through 14, get separated, the 2 older ones going to the mine commissary and the 2 younger ones going to a woman in a yellow bonnet who hadn't smiled once during the entire transaction. That last one had stayed with Elena, the way the 14-year-old had grabbed her youngest sister's arm at the last second, the way the administrator had to physically step between them, the way the little one had started crying and the older girl had gone completely still and blank-faced in the way that people go blank when the feeling is too large to fit on their face. Elena had looked away after that. Now it was her turn. "Elena Cross," the administrator called, age 19. He was a soft man in a wool suit that had been expensive once, maybe 5 years ago. His name was Alderman Fitch, and he had the particular kind of blankness in his eyes that came not from cruelty, but from having processed too many human beings as paperwork for too long. He looked at her the way you'd look at a column of numbers. She walked up the 3 steps to the platform without being told twice. She'd learned a long time ago that hesitating only made things worse, made the handlers grab your arm, made the administrators note something unfavorable in their ledgers. You walked when they said walk. You stood when they said stand. You kept your face neutral and your hands still, and you did not, under any circumstances, let them see you cry. The platform was elevated enough that she could see most of the crowd. 30, maybe 35 people, miners in dirty coats, a few shopkeepers, two women in the back who looked like they might be from the boarding house. A boy about 12 had climbed a fence post at the edge of the square to get a better view, and a man with a sheriff's badge stood to one side, arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Everyone looked at her. Nobody raised a hand. Fitch cleared his throat. As stated, age 19, in good health. He paused, consulting the papers in his hand. Prior placement history indicates experience with general domestic work, laundry, kitchen assistance, and basic care for younger children. No formal schooling beyond. What's wrong with her face? The voice came from the left side of the crowd. A heavy-set man in a buffalo coat, somewhere in his 40s, the kind of face that had been hit enough times to rearrange itself into something permanently unpleasant. He was holding a tin cup that wasn't full of coffee. Elena kept her eyes forward. "There's nothing wrong with her," Fitch said, with the mild irritation of a man whose presentation had been interrupted. "She's skinny," someone else said. This one she couldn't locate. "Doesn't look like she could haul much." "She looks like she'd break if you sneezed on her," a woman said, and a few people laughed. Elena breathed through her nose. In, out. She focused on a point just above the crowd, a weather vane on the roof of the hardware store, a rooster made of iron, spinning slow in the wind. Don't look at their faces. Don't let them see your jaw tighten. Don't. "She's a hard worker," Fitch said, though his voice had taken on the tone of a man who didn't entirely believe what he was saying. "I have documentation from the Holloway home attesting to her." "How come she's last?" the man in the buffalo coat asked. He took a step forward, and Elena could smell the whiskey from the platform. "Every other one went in the first few seconds. How come nobody's jumped on her?" The silence that followed was the worst thing Elena had ever heard, because it was the sound of people agreeing with him without saying a word. Fitch shuffled his papers. "We'll begin bidding at the standard. I'll take her." The buffalo coat man raised his cup. $20. A murmur moved through the crowd. Not surprise, more like the sound of a thing being decided. $20 was less than half the starting bid for any of the others that morning. It was an insult dressed up as commerce, and from the look in the man's eyes, flat and wet and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with labor, Elena understood very clearly what he wanted her for, and it was not hauling freight or scrubbing floors. She felt her hands go cold. They'd been cold before, sure, from the weather, but this was different. This was the cold that starts somewhere in your chest and radiates outward. "The standard opening bid is," Fitch began, "$25. Another voice. A man near the back. Elena looked. He was a merchant type, graying at the temples, looking at her with the clinical interest of someone pricing a piece of furniture. "30, the buffalo coat man said immediately. 35. 40. The numbers climbed slowly. Elena stood on the platform and listened to her future being auctioned off by men who weren't looking at her face. They were looking at her arms, her back, her hands, calculating labor costs and return on investment. The buffalo coat man had stopped bidding at 40, which meant the merchant type was going to win, which meant she would likely end up in a house somewhere doing whatever a man with cold eyes decided he needed done. She had gotten good, over the years, at recognizing which kinds of bad were better than other kinds of bad. This was the calculation she made now. The merchant seemed less immediately dangerous than the buffalo coat man. Less drunk, at least. The bidding slowed at $60. The merchant raised his hand again. 65. Silence. Fitch looked around. 65 going once. 100. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, to Elena's left. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. There was something in the quality of it, low and certain and completely unbothered, that cut right through the ambient noise of the square and made people turn. The man who had spoken was standing at the very edge of the crowd, and Elena's first thought was that she hadn't noticed him there before, which seemed impossible given his size. He was enormous, not in the blustery, puffed-up way of the buffalo coat man, but in the way of something built for hard use in hard weather. Broad through the shoulders, long-limbed with hands that were visible even from the platform as large and rough and scarred. He wore a heavy canvas coat over a flannel shirt, both of which had seen better decades. His hair was dark and needed cutting, and he had a beard that had grown in thick and unkempt. The kind of beard that wasn't a style choice but a result of simply not dealing with it for months at a time. He was looking at the platform, looking at her, not with hunger or appraisal or calculation, just looking in the direct, unblinking way of someone making a decision they've already thought through. Elena didn't know what to do with that. Fitch blinked. "I'm sorry, did you say $100? The man repeated. Same tone, same volume. The merchant dropped his hand. The buffalo coat man squinted at the newcomer. "Who the hell are you?" The large man didn't answer him. He looked at Fitch. "You want cash or you want coin? I've got both." Fitch opened and closed his mouth. Yes, cash is preferable, but standard procedure requires 200. The crowd went completely still. $200 in Red Hollow in 1887 was not a small amount. It was 6 months' wages for a working miner. It was the price of a decent horse and then some. It was the kind of number that made conversations stop and heads turn and men recalculate everything they thought they knew about a situation. The buffalo coat man's expression had shifted from predatory to suspicious. "What do you want with her so bad?" Again, the large man didn't answer him. He was already moving toward the administrator's table, reaching into the interior pocket of his coat, pulling out a folded piece of cloth that clinked with a sound Elena recognized, the particular heavy sound of gold coins. "That's—" Fitch leaned forward, and whatever he saw in that cloth made his voice change. "That's well above market." "I know what it is," the man said. He set the cloth on the table. "Papers." Fitch scrambled for his ledger. Elena stood on the platform and watched this happen, and could not figure out what she was feeling. It wasn't relief. She didn't know this man, didn't know his intentions, didn't know if this was better or worse or just differently bad. It wasn't fear exactly, though the smart part of her brain was pointing out very firmly that she had just been purchased by a stranger for twice the going rate, and that was not inherently a safe situation. What she felt mostly was numb. The buffalo coat man pushed forward through the crowd toward the administrator's table, and his voice had gone ugly. "Now hold on. I was first. I made the opening bid, and you can't just—" "I can," Fitch said, and the mild-mannered administrator seemed to have discovered some backbone somewhere. "The process allows open bidding, and the highest bid wins. That is the process." "The process?" The man's face had gone red. He turned to look at the newcomer. "You. Mountain Man. What's your game?" The large man was signing something. He finished, straightened up, and looked at the buffalo coat man directly for the first time. Elena watched it happen the moment their eyes met, and whatever was in the large man's expression made the other man take one slow step backward. Just one. But he took it. "No game," the large man said. "Go find something else to do with your afternoon." A long moment. The buffalo coat man worked his jaw, looked at the crowd, seemed to realize he didn't have the support he'd thought he might, and made a sound that was half a curse and half a cough, and turned and walked away toward the nearest saloon. The crowd began to break up. Show was over. Fitch handed something to the large man. A fold of papers, documents, the kind of things that transferred legal responsibility from one party to another. The large man looked at them once, folded them, and tucked them away. Then he turned and looked up at the platform. Elena was still standing there. She hadn't moved. He walked to the base of the steps and stopped. "You're Elena Cross," he said. "Yes." Her voice came out steady. She was almost surprised. "Can you walk?" Odd question. "Of course I can walk." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, not anything she could put a name to. "Then come down." She came down the 3 steps, one hand on the railing, and stood in front of him on the mud street of Red Hollow. Up close, he was even larger than he'd looked from the platform, and there was a scar along his jaw that disappeared into his beard, and his eyes were a dark gray green that reminded her, stupidly, of water under ice. "My name is Rowan Blackthorne," he said. "I have a cabin in the mountains, about a day's ride from here." She waited. "I'm going there now," he said. "You can come with me or I can leave you here. Either way, those papers say you're free of the system." He paused. "It's your choice." She looked at him for a long moment, looked at the papers folded inside his coat. looked at the empty platform behind her and the crowd dispersing and the buffalo coat man's back disappearing through the saloon door. "You just spent $200, she said, "and now you're saying it's my choice?" "I said what I said." "Why?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Because some things need doing." He turned and started walking toward the edge of town. "There's a gray horse at the livery. We'll need to get moving before the light goes." She stood in the middle of the empty square for a moment. The wind pushed a scrap of paper across the mud. The iron rooster on the hardware store still turned. Then she followed him. The horse's name, she eventually learned, was Grit, and the name suited him. A gray roan with a stubborn set to his ears and a tendency to stop without warning to investigate interesting smells. Rowan led him by the bridle most of the way through town, and Elena walked beside them both, carrying her one bag, which contained a change of clothes, a book with a cracked spine, and a small tin box that had belonged to her mother. She hadn't spoken since the square. Neither had he. At the edge of town, where the main road turned to a dirt track that wound north toward the mountain's base, Rowan stopped and looked at her. "You can ride," he said, "or walk. Track's not even for the first mile, so if you'd rather walk, I'll walk." He nodded, and they went on. The town fell away behind them gradually, the way things do when you're leaving somewhere on foot. Slowly enough that you could still hear it for a long time. The sounds of people and horses and commerce, and then slowly less, and then it was just wind and the creak of Grit's bridle and the soft sound of boots and hooves on frozen ground. After about a half mile, Elena said, "Where did you get $200 in gold coin?" "Mind it." "From where?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a seam up in the eastern fork of the valley. Hard to reach. Dangerous, really. Most operations won't go up there because the rock's unstable and the air gets bad in the lower tunnels." He didn't look at her when he said it. "I went up there." Elena absorbed that. A dangerous mine that other people avoided. For $200 in coin. To spend on a girl nobody wanted. "Why?" she asked. His jaw worked. "I told you." "You told me some things need doing," she said. "That's not an answer." He looked at her then, sideways, and she had the sudden sense that he wasn't used to being pushed back on. Not in an aggressive way, more like someone who had spent a lot of time alone and had forgotten that conversations moved in two directions. "No," he said. "It isn't." He looked forward again. "We'll have time to talk. Right now I'd like to get above the valley before dark." It wasn't a dismissal. It was, she decided, something closer to honest. He had his reasons. He would tell her when he was ready. She could push harder or she could let it be. She let it be. For now. The track steepened as they climbed and the trees thickened around them. Pine and spruce and the occasional aspen, already bare, their white trunks catching what was left of the afternoon light. The temperature dropped with the altitude, and Elena buttoned her coat all the way up and pulled the collar around her ears. Grit moved carefully on the rocky sections, placing his feet with an intelligence that suggested he knew this path well. Rowan moved carefully too, not from uncertainty but from habit, checking the ground ahead, noting where a stone had loosened or where water had frozen over a dip in the trail. He stopped twice and listened. She noticed, the second time, that his hand moved to something under his coat, something at his hip. "Is this a safe route?" she asked. "Mostly. Mostly. There have been men through here. Prospectors, mostly. Sometimes less polite." He started walking again. "We haven't had trouble in a while." She noted the "we" and filed it away. The light was going orange and purple in the gaps between the trees when they came through a narrow pass between two ridges, and Elena stopped walking and stared. Below them, caught in the last of the evening light, was a valley. Not a large valley, maybe half a mile across, shaped like a cupped hand, sheltered on three sides by the mountain's spine. There was a stream running through it, not yet frozen, silver in the fading light. There were trees, but not choking thick, enough for windbreak, enough for wood, with open meadow in the center where the snow lay unbroken and clean. And at the far edge of the meadow, backed against the western slope, a cabin. It was not a romantic cabin. It was not the kind of cabin that appeared in illustrations. It was large and solid and dark with weatherproofing, built from logs that had been notched and fitted with care, with a stone chimney that was already trailing a thin line of smoke, which meant he had left a fire banked before he went to town, which meant he had planned to come back with someone. There was a barn, smaller, off to one side. A woodpile that was genuinely impressive in size. A root cellar door she could just make out, half covered in snow. The practical bones of a life. She stood there looking at it for longer than she intended. "Not what you expected," Rowan said. He wasn't asking. "I didn't expect anything," she said. That was mostly true. He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement and started down the slope. Inside the cabin was a single large room divided by function rather than walls. Near the door, pegs for coats and gear, a rough-hewn bench, a place for boots. Across from that, a fireplace large enough to stand in, with an iron grate and a collection of pokers and tongs that had the look of tools that were actually used rather than displayed. 2 chairs in front of it, mismatched. One looked homemade, one looked like it had been carried up the mountain from somewhere civilized. Against the right wall, a cot, a small table, a lamp, a rag rug on the floor that was clean but worn nearly to threads in the center, and along the back wall and into a kind of alcove, shelves, books, more books than she'd seen outside the Holloway home's so-called library, which had contained 12 volumes, 4 of which were Bibles, and 2 of which were agricultural almanacs from 15 years ago. She couldn't read the titles from here, but the sheer number of them, maybe 200, maybe more, stacked and shelved with the inconsistent organization of a person who reads them constantly and puts them back approximately where they belong, stopped her. "There's a loft," Rowan said from behind her. She turned. He was hanging his coat on a peg. "You'll sleep up there. There's a mattress and blankets. It's warmer than down here, rises up from the fire." She looked at the ladder against the far wall leading up to the loft. "And you?" she asked. "I'll sleep here." He nodded toward the cot without particular emphasis. She looked at the loft, looked at him, looked at the door, which was closed now against the cold. He saw what she was doing. She could tell because he stopped moving and gave her a moment to do it. "There's no lock on the loft," she said. "Not an accusation, just a fact." "No," he agreed, "but the front door locks from the inside and you can take the key up with you if you want. I'll be outside first thing either way. There's stock to tend." A man who kept secrets in a mountain cabin, who had bought her at auction for a sum that didn't make economic sense, who read apparently everything he could get his hands on, and who was telling her to take the key. She didn't know yet what to do with Rowan Blackthorne, but she filed that away too. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and moved to the fire to build it up. Dinner was beans and salt pork and cornbread that he made from a batter he kept in a covered crock. And it was not good food in any elevated sense, but it was hot and plentiful, and he put a second portion in her bowl without asking whether she wanted it. She ate everything. She had learned early that you always ate everything. He ate across from her at the small table, and they didn't speak much. At some point she asked how long the winter usually lasted here, and he said often through April, sometimes into May, in a hard year. She asked if he ever went down to town, and he said when he needed to and left it at that. She asked if he lived here alone. He said yes. Something in the way he said it made her not ask anything else. After dinner, she helped clean up, which he seemed not to expect. There was a small hesitation when she took the bowl from his hands to wash it, like he'd forgotten that was a thing people did together. She washed, he dried, and then she took the key he'd said she could have and climbed the ladder to the loft. It was warm up there, just as he'd said. There was a straw mattress with real blankets, 2 of them, heavy wool, and a small window the size of a dinner plate that looked out onto the valley below. She could see the stars beginning, the sky going from purple to black to the specific deep clear dark that you only got at altitude. She set her bag down, took off her boots, sat on the mattress and put the key in her palm and looked at it. He could take the ladder away. That was the practical thought she had. He could take the ladder away and she'd have no way down, and she'd have to jump and likely break something on the floor below, which was, she looked, hardwood, rough and unfinished. She thought about this for a while. Then she put the key on the little shelf beside the mattress and lay down and pulled both blankets over her and listened to the sounds of the cabin below. The fire settling, grit moving in the barn outside, the wind beginning to pick up around the ridgeline. She did not sleep for a long time, but she did sleep eventually. That was something. The first week was an exercise in mutual caution. They were two people who had both learned, through different paths and different damage, to take up as little space as possible around others. The result was a cabin that sometimes felt like it had too many unspoken things in it, and sometimes felt like the most carefully quiet place Elena had ever occupied. He was up before she was every morning, always. When she came down the ladder, the fire was already going, and there was usually something on: coffee or cornmeal, or occasionally eggs if he'd been to the hen house. He never called up to wake her. He just let her sleep until she woke. She figured out the water situation by watching him: the stream, in the morning before it got churned up, or the barrel he kept at the north corner of the cabin that collected snowmelt. She figured out where he kept the dry goods and where he kept the perishables. She figured out that the outhouse was 20 yards past the barn and that he'd worn a clear path to it in the snow. She started making herself useful. Not because he asked, he didn't, but because it was the only thing that made her feel like she had a right to be in the space. She swept out the cabin. She organized the dry goods so she could find things without rooting around. She mended a shirt she found thrown over the back of the handmade chair, using a needle and thread she found in a small tin on the upper shelf. When he came in from the barn that afternoon and saw the shirt draped neatly over the same chair, mended at the shoulder seam that had been pulling out, he stopped and looked at it. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." He picked the shirt up, looked at the stitching. "This is good work." "I know that too." He put the shirt down and went to wash his hands at the basin, and she thought she saw something in the set of his shoulders that was different from before. Not relaxed exactly, just less braced. Small things. They were all small things at first. She started noticing during that first week that he had headaches. He would go quiet in a particular way, quieter than his usual quiet, and put his hand to the back of his neck and press, and keep his eyes down. She'd seen this pattern before, in the older boys at Holloway. Too many blows to the head over too many years. She didn't say anything about it, but she started making willow bark tea in the afternoons without comment and leaving it within his reach, and he started drinking it, also without comment. She noticed that he slept badly. She could hear it from the loft, the shifting, the occasional sharp sound he made that might have been a word, the long silences that somehow felt louder than the rest. She knew what bad sleep looked like. She'd had it herself, most of her life. She noticed that he had books he was partway through on almost every surface, open, face down, bookmarked with whatever was handy, which was usually a strip of leather or a folded piece of paper. He wasn't reading any of them front to back. He was jumping around, picking one up when the mood suited, setting it down, picking up another. She recognized this too. It wasn't carelessness. It was a person who found other places easier to live in than the one they were actually in. She started picking up the books after a few days, looking at the pages they were open to, curious about what he'd been reading and why. History, mostly. Some natural philosophy. A battered collection of poetry with a name written inside the front cover in ink so old it had gone brown. Margaret Blackthorne. She closed that one carefully and put it back exactly where she'd found it. On the fifth day, he spoke more than usual. She wasn't sure what prompted it. Maybe the weather, which had shifted to a hard, steady snow that penned them both inside for most of the afternoon. He had been carving something at the table, a piece of wood shaped vaguely like an animal, and she had been reading a history of the Spanish missions in New Mexico, which was dull but better than staring at the wall, when he said, without preamble, "You warm enough at night?" She looked up. "Yes, the blankets are good. There's another one in the cedar chest, under the loft. I'm warm enough." He went back to carving, then, "You sleep all right?" "Well enough." He was quiet for a moment. "The first few nights in a new place, it's hard." "It's fine," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not asking to be polite. I'm asking because if you're not sleeping, I can—" He stopped. "Can what?" "I don't know, something." He shrugged, a little uncomfortably, and went back to the wood. "I just meant to ask." She thought about that. A man who had spent months alone in a mountain cabin, developing the particular social awkwardness of the truly isolated, asking whether she was sleeping, not because he needed her rested for labor, just because he was asking. "I wake up sometimes," she said. "In the night. I have for years. It passes." He nodded, didn't push. "You too," she said. His hand stilled on the wood, I can hear from the loft, she said, not unkindly. Not what you say, just that you're restless. A long pause. Yeah. The word came out rough. For years. They sat with that for a while, and the snow fell past the small windows, and the fire popped and settled, and two damaged people who'd learned not to say too much sat in the same room and found, slowly, that the silence between them had changed into something slightly less careful. It wasn't trust. Not yet. Not close. But it was something. Some early, fragile version of something. She went back to the Spanish missions. He went back to his carving. Outside, the snow kept falling, softening the whole sharp world down into something that looked, from a distance, almost gentle. On the 7th day, he found her crying. She hadn't meant to. She'd gone to the barn for no particular reason, maybe just to be in a different space, to be around Grit's patient warmth and the smell of hay and animals, which was, she had discovered, oddly comforting. She'd sat down on a hay bale and had been perfectly fine for several minutes, and then she had not been fine, and the crying had come the way it always did for her, fast and violent and almost completely silent, because she had learned young that crying loudly brought attention, and attention brought trouble. She heard the barn door and shoved the heel of her hand against her eyes and turned away. Elena. Not a question. He'd seen already. I'm fine, she said. Her voice was rough. Just give me a minute. He didn't leave, but he also didn't come closer. She heard him stop just inside the door. Grit nickered softly. You don't have to be fine, he said. I said I'm fine. She took a breath that shuddered more than she wanted it to. It's stupid. What is? I was just... She stopped. Started again. I was counting days here. 7, he said. 7 days is the longest I've ever stayed in one place without someone telling me to leave, or moving me. She stared at the wall of the barn. I was counting the days, and it just... She stopped again. It's stupid. He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked across the barn and sat down on the hay bale opposite her, far enough away that it wasn't crowding, close enough that it wasn't dismissal, and looked at the same wall she was looking at. It's not stupid, he said. You don't have to say that. I know I don't have to. He said it the same way he said most things, flat and certain, like he'd checked it against something before he said it out loud. 7 years ago I came up here, and the first time I left to go back down to town, I walked about a mile out of the valley and then just stood on the trail for 20 minutes because I couldn't figure out why I'd want to go somewhere that wasn't here. She looked at him. It takes a while, he said, for a place to feel like yours. And sometimes when it starts to, that's when the bad feelings come up, not when things are bad. When they're... He seemed to search for the word. When they're safer. She thought about that. It sounded right in a way she couldn't quite articulate, a truth that fit even though she'd never heard it stated before. How do you know that? She asked. He picked up a piece of straw and turned it between his fingers. I know it because I stayed up here until I could figure out how to live in a world that kept not working the way it was supposed to, and it took a long time, and some of the hardest days came after I thought I'd gotten through the worst of it. She looked at him for a while. At his hands, the straw, at the scar along his jaw, at the particular stillness of someone who'd made a kind of peace with something, not a clean peace, but a livable one. I'm not going anywhere, she said. It came out different than she meant it, more uncertain, like a question. No, he said. I know. The barn was warm from the animal heat, and outside the snow had stopped and the afternoon light was coming at an angle through the gap under the door, and Grit had gone back to his hay, and Elena Cross wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat there for a few more minutes until the feeling passed. He stayed until it did. Then they both went back inside, and he made coffee, and neither of them mentioned it again. But something had shifted in the subtle architecture of the space between two people. Something that had been at an angle was now slightly more square. She noticed it. She thought he did too. She did not name it. It was too early for names, but she noticed it, and she filed it away with all the other things she was learning about Rowan Blackthorne. The headaches, the bad sleep, the $200 in coin from a dangerous mine, the scar, the books, the name in faded ink, Margaret Blackthorne. She would learn that name's story eventually. She was beginning to think she wanted to. The second week began with a broken axe handle and an argument. Rowan had been splitting wood since before dawn. She could hear the rhythmic thud of it from the loft, steady and unhurried, the way he did most things. And when she came down the ladder and went out to tell him coffee was ready, she found him standing over the woodpile holding the two halves of a hickory handle, looking at them with the expression of a man who was deciding whether to be angry or just practical about it. "How long has that been cracked?" she asked. "A while." "You kept using it?" "I was going to replace it." "When?" He set the pieces down on the woodpile. "When I got to it." She looked at the stack of unsplit wood, still considerable, and then at the pile already done, which was enormous, enough to heat the cabin for 2 months at least. He'd been out here a long time this morning. "There's coffee," she said. He picked up the broken pieces and carried them toward the barn without answering, but he came inside 20 minutes later with wood shavings in his beard and sat down at the table and drank the coffee she poured him. And that, she was learning, was how conversations with Rowan Blackthorne tended to resolve. Not with words exactly, but with a kind of movement back toward the shared space that meant the same thing words would have. She was learning his patterns, not deliberately at first, and then more deliberately as the days stacked up, and she found herself with enough mental quiet to actually pay attention to things outside her own immediate survival. This was new. For most of her life, paying attention to other people's patterns had been a defensive strategy. You watched the adults at Holloway to know when someone's mood was turning. You watched the other kids to know who would steal your food or your blanket if you weren't careful. It was a form of vigilance that had kept her in a low-grade state of readiness for years. This was different. She watched Rowan not to protect herself, but because she was curious, and that distinction felt enormous, even if she couldn't have fully explained why. She learned that he ate slowly and without much apparent pleasure, the way of someone who'd spent long periods eating alone and had lost the habit of treating meals as anything other than necessary maintenance. She started making things that required more attention to eat, a stew with small bones or dried apple slices that needed working through, and noticed that he slowed down even further and occasionally said something about the food that wasn't exactly a compliment, but wasn't nothing either. "This is good." Or once, looking into his bowl with a slight frown, "What did you put in this?" She told him juniper berries from the bag on the third shelf. He made a considering sound and ate the rest without complaint. She learned that he didn't talk for the sake of talking, which she actually appreciated, having spent years surrounded by the constant low noise of the Holloway home, kids crying, administrators lecturing, the nightly chorus of snoring and coughing, and occasional screaming from the nightmares of children who had reasons for nightmares. The quiet of the cabin was something she'd been suspicious of at first, reading it as a held breath before something bad, and now was beginning to understand as simply quiet. Just that. Not threatening, not loaded. She learned that he went still sometimes, in a particular way, like a thought had grabbed him somewhere deep and was holding him there. She learned to leave him alone when this happened, and he always came back from it in a few minutes, blinking slightly, and picked up whatever he'd been doing. She did not yet know where he went when he went still like that. She was starting to want to know. The second week also brought her first real experience of the valley in daylight, because the snow cleared on the third day of that week, and Rowan told her without particular ceremony that the stream had a stretch about a quarter-mile south that didn't freeze solid until deep January, and that the cold water was better than the barrel for washing if she wanted. She went, partly because she did want to wash properly, and partly because she needed to be outside and alone for a little while. The valley was different without the filter of cold and the anxiety of arrival. She walked the quarter-mile in borrowed snow boots. Hers were ruined, and he'd produced a pair from the back of a shelf that were too large but stuffed with wool, which was a practical kindness she chose not to examine too carefully. And she stood at the edge of the unfrozen stretch of stream and looked around. The mountains held the valley on 3 sides, enormous and indifferent and white above the tree line. Below that, the pine forest was dense and dark and smelled of resin and cold, clean in the way that things are clean when no human has bothered them for a long time. A pair of ravens moved in the air above the far ridge, and their calls came down to her small and sharp. She crouched at the stream's edge and put her hand in the water. It was shockingly cold, the kind of cold that was almost painful, and then went past pain into something else, something that was just very real and very immediate. She held her hand there until it ached and then pulled it out and dried it on her coat and stood up and looked at the valley again. Nobody knew she was here. The thought arrived fully formed and strange. Not nobody in the sense of being abandoned. She was past that particular flavor of bad feeling, or getting past it, slowly. Nobody in the sense of the people who had spent years making decisions about where she was, and what she did, and what she was worth. They didn't know where she was. She was not on a list somewhere. She was not on a platform, or in a dormitory with 30 other girls, or in a placement that had turned bad and needed to be endured until the next one. She was standing beside a stream in a mountain valley, and the only person who knew she was here was a scarred, largely silent man who had told her it was her choice and given her the key to the loft. She started crying again, the second time in as many weeks, which was more than she usually allowed herself. She blamed the cold water. She cried for a few minutes, silent and fast as always, and then stopped, and then washed her hair in the stream because she'd said she was coming to wash and she was going to wash. And the cold was so extreme that by the time she was done, she felt scraped clean and more alive than she had in months. She walked back to the cabin with her wet hair going stiff in the cold air and smoke coming from the chimney and the low sound of grit moving in the barn, and she went inside and stood by the fire until she stopped shaking. Rowan looked at her wet hair and said nothing. Then he went to the cedar chest under the loft and pulled out an extra blanket and handed it to her and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She put the blanket around her shoulders and sat by the fire and was, against all reasonable expectation, all right. She was, against all reasonable expectation, something close to all right. The days continued to stack. 3 weeks in, she discovered the library. Not the shelves in the main room. She'd already found those, already made quiet progress through their contents. But the alcove, the deeper section around the corner of the back wall that she hadn't fully explored because it had felt too private, too much like a room that belonged to someone in a way she hadn't yet earned access to. She'd gone back there looking for a specific book she'd seen the title of on the lower shelf, A Natural History of the Rocky Mountain Region, which she'd thought might tell her something useful about the valley, and found it, and found also that the alcove went deeper than she'd realized, with a second tier of shelving and a small lamp on a bracket and a low stool placed precisely under the lamp, worn to a shine on its top from long use. She found the journals on the third shelf, behind a row of geology texts. She didn't open them that day. They were clearly personal, bound in leather, a stack of 5 or 6, the oldest visibly more worn than the recent ones. She looked at them for a moment and then took the natural history book and went back to the main room. But she thought about them. She thought about them for 3 more days before she said anything. "Those journals in the back," she said one evening while they were both near the fire. He was doing something with a piece of harness leather and an awl, repairing something that needed repairing. She was reading, or pretending to. He didn't look up. "What about them? Are they yours?" "Mostly." She waited. "Some of them are older," he said, after a moment. "From before." "Before you came here?" "Before a lot of things." He worked the awl through the leather. "You can read them if you want." She hadn't expected that. "I wasn't asking to—" "I know you weren't." He looked up then, briefly. "I'm telling you that you can." She went back to her book. He went back to the harness. The fire moved between them, and the wind pressed at the roof. And she sat with the knowledge of those journals like a hand extended that she wasn't quite sure how to take. 2 days later, she went back to the alcove and sat on the worn stool and opened the oldest one. The first entries were brief and functional. Dates, weather observations, notes about the mining work, supplies needed. The handwriting was different from what she'd seen of his current writing. Less controlled, more angular, the writing of a younger man or a more agitated one. She read through the first 20 pages quickly, getting a sense of things. He had come to the mountain alone 7 years ago, as he'd said. He had built the cabin himself over 2 seasons. He had made himself into a man who could survive there through what sounded like sheer persistence and a fair number of serious mistakes. Lost the first winter's worth of cured meat to moisture in the cellar. Spent 2 weeks eating mostly pine bark broth. Will not do that again. She almost smiled. The tone of the journals shifted around the 3rd year. The entries got longer, less practical, more internal. Something had happened. She read around it for several entries before she found it stated plainly. in the careful way of someone writing a thing they'd been avoiding. Heard from the territorial office about the situation in Prescott. M is gone. There's nothing to go back for now. I don't know how to feel about the fact that I'm relieved and that the relief makes me feel sick. M. Margaret. She read on. It came in pieces, the way the truth usually does, assembled from fragments across multiple entries over multiple evenings of sitting on the stool in the alcove with the lamp turned up and her own breathing slow and careful. Margaret Blackthorne had been his younger sister, 6 years younger. When their parents died, their father first, from a mining accident, their mother 2 years later from something the journals called the consumption, which was the word people used when they couldn't afford the doctor enough to know the real name. Rowan had been 20, Margaret 14, and the territorial welfare system had done what the territorial welfare system did, which was separate them. She had gone to a county institution in Prescott. He had spent the next several years trying to earn enough money to get her out, which meant the mines, which meant working in conditions that left the scar on his jaw, and apparently several others she hadn't seen, and which meant not seeing her for stretches of months at a time, because the institution was far, and travel was expensive, and every dollar spent on a stage ticket was a dollar not saved for the legal fees that might eventually get her free. By the time he had enough, by the time the papers were nearly in order, she was gone. The institution had what it called an illness, a fever moving through the dormitories, and Margaret Blackthorne had been 17 years old and not strong enough, and the territorial office had sent him a letter, and the letter had said what such letters said, and Rowan had been up here on the mountain when it arrived, and he had... The entry stopped mid-sentence. The next one was 2 months later, just a date and a weather observation. Then nothing for 6 more months. Elena sat with the journal in her lap and looked at the lamp flame for a long time. She understood now where he went when he went still. She understood the bad sleep. She understood why a man who'd spent 7 years alone on a mountain had looked at a girl on an auction platform and decided, quietly and completely, that he was going to do something about it. She understood, and the understanding sat in her chest like a stone. Not a bad stone, not the kind you wanted gone, but the kind that had weight and was real and meant something. She put the journal back carefully, in the exact position she'd found it, and came back to the main room. Rowan was at the table, working on something by lamplight, and he looked up when she came around the corner. He looked at her face and then looked back down at his work. "The last entry and the third one," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "The one that stops in the middle." He was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "About Margaret." The name in his handwriting, in old brown ink on the flysheet of the poetry book. He didn't answer for a moment. When he did, his voice was lower than usual. "She would have been 24 this year." Elena sat down in the homemade chair. "What was she like?" He looked up at that, surprised by the question. Most people, she supposed, would have said something careful and moved on. But she was not most people, and she was genuinely asking. "Stubborn," he said. Something that was almost a smile moved across his face and was gone. She had opinions about everything, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. Argued with me constantly. He looked at the table. She was always cold. Even in summer, she was always cold. She'd steal my coat, and I'd yell at her, and she'd just... He stopped. Started again. She never once apologized for anything in her life. "She sounds like she was something." She was. He said it plainly, without the softening people usually put around grief. She was something. Elena folded her hands in her lap. "You should have been able to save her." He looked at her. "I'm not saying it the way it sounds," she said quickly. "I mean, the system should have let you. You were trying. You had the money eventually. They just..." She stopped. "They didn't care enough to wait." He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said. "They didn't." The fire was burning low, and outside the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that pushed against the walls of the cabin like a living thing, looking for gaps. Elena got up and put another log on without being asked, and came back and sat down, and they stayed there for a while in the particular quiet of two people who have shared something true, and are sitting with the weight of it. "The reason you went to town," she said. "Yes." "The gold from the eastern seam." "Yes." She looked at him. "How long did it take?" "To mine that much?" He calculated. 14 months, working the seam when the air was good enough and pulling back when it wasn't. The rock in there is rotten. Cave-ins every other week. He said it the way you'd describe an inconvenience. I needed the amount to be enough to guarantee the outcome. Couldn't risk being outbid. 14 months. He had spent 14 months in a dangerous mine for $200 in gold to buy a girl he'd watched from a distance and decided to save because his sister had died in a system that hadn't cared enough to wait. Why me specifically? She asked. There were 23 others. The question had been sitting in her since the first day, and she'd been waiting for the moment when asking it felt right. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, I came down to town about 18 months ago for supplies. Saw the Holloway home transport coming through. They do it twice a year, move some of the older ones to work placements in the area. He paused. You were in the back of the wagon. You had a split lip, and you were looking out at the mountains, and you had this expression on your face like you were memorizing them. She didn't remember this. She remembered very little about the transit days. They blurred together in her memory. Cold wagon beds and different faces and the constant low-grade calculation of figuring out where the danger was. I watched you for the rest of that trip, he said. And I came back to town 3 times after that, just to... He stopped. The word he'd been about to use seemed to embarrass him. To check. To check, she repeated. To make sure you were still... He set down whatever he'd been working on. I didn't plan it the way it sounds. I wasn't watching you strange. I just needed to know someone was watching, since no one else was. The stone in her chest was heavier now, not unpleasantly so. You went into a mine that could have killed you, she said, for a year and 2 months, for someone you'd seen twice. 3 times, he said, and it seemed like the thing to do. He picked up his work again. I'm aware it doesn't sound like anything, she said. It sounds like you did it. He looked at her. She held the look until he was the one who looked away, and she felt something in that exchange that she couldn't name but recognized as important. She went to bed that night with the image of herself in the back of a supply wagon, looking at the mountains she hadn't known yet, and a man at the edge of the road who'd seen something in her face and decided it mattered. She had not felt like she mattered for a very long time. The feeling was uncomfortable in the specific way that unfamiliar things are uncomfortable, like wearing a coat that fit well after years of coats that didn't. The fit itself was strange, but it was the right kind of strange. She lay in the loft with the key on the shelf beside her. She still took it up every night, old habit, and listened to the wind and the settling of the cabin, and after a while, the quieter than usual sounds of Rowan below, and thought about the word watching and the way he'd said it and what a person does with the knowledge that someone saw them when they thought no one was looking. She did not have an answer for that yet. She was beginning to think she wanted one. The days that followed had a different texture, not dramatically different. He still spoke little. She still kept herself busy with the domestic work that needed doing and the books she was steadily making her way through, and the valley was still locked in the particular silence of a mountain winter. But something between them had shifted in the way of things that shift quietly and can't be shifted back. She caught him watching her sometimes, the way he described observant and still, and instead of making her nervous, it made her feel oddly seen. She started talking more, filling silences that had previously been fine with snippets of things she was reading, observations about the weather or the animals, small pieces of her own history offered up in the casual way of someone testing whether a surface will hold weight before putting more on it. He listened. He always listened. Occasionally he asked a question, short and direct, and she'd answer, and he'd nod and go quiet again, and she'd realize later that the question had been exactly the right one. One afternoon, she told him about the Holloway home in more detail than she'd intended. The 3rd administrator in 4 years, the one who'd decided the older girls were old enough to handle work details that the boys weren't assigned to, the winter she'd been 13 and the heating had failed for 2 weeks, and they'd all slept in one room with coats over their blankets. She told it matter-of-factly, the way she'd learned to discuss bad things, like they'd happened to someone else who'd then given her the memory to carry. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How old were you when you went in?" 8, she said. "Both my parents died the same winter. Different things. I know how that goes." "I know you do." They looked at each other, and it was not the cautious look of 2 strangers sharing proximity. It was something else. The look of two people who had taken different roads to the same kind of hard country and found each other there. She did not say what she was thinking. She was thinking that she had spent 11 years waiting for a place that felt like it might not require her to brace herself, and that it had taken a mountain and a silent man and 14 months of dangerous mining and everything going very badly before it very slowly went less bad, and that she was beginning to suspect, with a carefulness that felt almost superstitious, that she might have found what she'd been waiting for. She did not say it. It was too early. The kind of thing you name too soon had a way of breaking under the weight of the naming. But she thought it, sitting in the homemade chair by the fire, with the wind outside and the lamp on the table and the smell of pine and coffee and wood smoke that was becoming, grain by grain, day by day, the smell of somewhere she was allowed to be. She thought it, and she held it carefully, and she did not say it out loud. Outside, the snow fell again, steady and patient, covering the valley in another layer of white, and the mountains held their ground against the sky, enormous and indifferent, and somehow, in the way of enormous indifferent things, a kind of comfort after all. She found the last journal by accident. It was the 5th week, and she had developed enough of a routine that she moved through the cabin with a kind of ease she hadn't expected to find in herself. She knew where things were. She knew which floorboard creaked loudest near the door, and which log in the woodpile pulled free without disturbing the stack, and which drawer in the kitchen area stuck when the humidity dropped. She knew the cabin the way you know a place you've stopped being a guest in, and the knowing of it still surprised her sometimes, catching her off guard in small moments. Reaching for the coffee without looking, finding it exactly where she'd left it, and feeling something quiet and startled move through her chest. She had been cleaning the alcove that morning, which was overdue. The shelves collected a particular kind of dust up here, fine and dry, that settled in thin layers between the books and needed to come off with a cloth before it got into the bindings. She'd been working from the top shelf down, pulling books out in small groups, wiping the shelf, replacing them, and she was on the second to last shelf when she pulled out the geology texts and found, behind them, a journal she hadn't seen before. It was newer than the others. The leather was barely worn, the binding still stiff. She almost put it back without opening it. She would have maybe if it hadn't fallen open on its own to a page near the middle, the spine creasing at a spot that had been opened many times. The date at the top of the page stopped her. It was 18 months ago, nearly to the week. She knew that date. She knew it because he'd told her, "I came down to town about 18 months ago for supplies." She stood in the alcove with the dustcloth in one hand and the journal in the other and read. Saw the Holloway transport coming through on the Meridian Road. Stopped to let the wagon pass. There was a girl in the back, older than the others, maybe 17 or 18. Dark hair. She had a cut on her mouth that was still fresh. She was looking at the peaks above the valley, the way people look at things they don't believe they're allowed to want. I don't know why I kept watching after the wagon passed. I told myself I was just resting grit. That's not why I was watching. Elena's hands had gone very still. She turned the page. The next entry was 2 weeks later. He'd gone back to town for a reason he didn't specify in the journal, and he'd seen her again. This time outside the general store, carrying a load of laundry for what he described as a boarding house on the east end of the main street. He had noted, with a bluntness that was entirely characteristic of his writing, that she walked like someone who expected to be hit, and that the man overseeing the laundry work had spoken to her in a way that made Rowan's jaw tighten just recording it. She didn't flinch. That's the thing. He said it and she didn't flinch at all, just kept walking. I've seen men in the mines go numb like that after long enough. It's not strength, it's what's left when the other thing runs out. She read on. She read standing up in the alcove, with the dustcloth forgotten in her hand and the morning light coming thin through the small window, and the smell of pine and cold around her. He had gone back 4 times in the 14 months. Not 3, as he'd told her. 4. She filed the discrepancy away without judgment. People told the truth in uneven ways. They rounded down on things that felt like too much to admit. Each visit was documented. Brief entries, practical in tone, but the specificity of what he recorded, the details he noticed and chose to write down, told a different story underneath the flat language. The color of her coat, which he noted was getting thinner at the elbows as the months passed. The way she'd gotten into an argument with a shopkeeper's wife one October afternoon and stood her ground until the woman backed down, which he had apparently watched from across the street and recorded with something that read, even in his restrained prose, a great deal like admiration. The day he'd seen her sitting on the steps of the boarding house in early spring, reading a book with such focus that she hadn't noticed a dog nosing at her skirt for a full 2 minutes. She read the way M used to read, like the book was a room she could actually go into. Elena stood with that sentence for a long moment. The dust cloth had fallen to the floor. She didn't pick it up. She read the entry about the labor placement drive, the territorial notice posted in Red Hollow the previous month, announcing the auction date, listing the Holloway home among the sending institutions. She read Rowan's response to it, which was 4 lines. The Holloway group will be there. I checked the list. E-Cross, age 19, is scheduled for placement. I've been thinking about the Eastern Seam for a year. I know why I haven't gone back to it. I think I know what I'm going to do. I think I've known for a while. She closed the journal. She stood in the alcove for a long time, not thinking exactly, but not thinking either. It was more like being very still while something large rearranged itself around her, the way you stand still in moving water while the current does what it's going to do. He had watched her. For 18 months. He had gone into a mine that could have killed him, that had nearly killed him on at least 2 occasions she'd read about in the older journals, and he had pulled gold out of bad rock by himself. And he had gone back to town 4 times over a year and a half just to see that she was still, as he'd put it, still there. Not because he was strange, not because he wanted to own her. She understood that now with a certainty that had nothing to do with trust being given and everything to do with trust being earned over 5 weeks of small and consistent evidence. Because she had looked at the mountains like she was memorizing them. Because she walked like someone who expected to be hit and didn't flinch anyway. Because she reminded him of Margaret, not in her face or her manner, but in the particular quality of a person who was surviving something they shouldn't have had to survive and doing it without the dignity of being witnessed. He had witnessed her. Before she even knew there was anything to witness. She came out of the alcove carrying the journal and found Rowan at the kitchen end of the main room, his back to her, doing something at the work table. She heard him hear her footsteps and the slight adjustment in how he was standing that meant he knew she was there. She put the journal on the table between them. He turned. He looked at the journal. He looked at her face. How far did you read? He said. The last entry. She kept her voice even. The one before you went to town. He looked at the journal. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt, exactly, but the discomfort of someone whose private thing had become less private. I should have told you it was there. You said I could read the journals. I said the others. You said the journals. She paused. Did you mean to leave that one out? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said, which was a more honest answer than she'd expected. Maybe, maybe not. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He remained standing, which was uncomfortable enough that after a moment he sat too, and they were across the table from each other with the journal between them like a third presence in the conversation. 18 months, she said. Yes. And 4 times, not 3. He held her look. 4 times. The argument with the shopkeeper's wife, she said. You watched the whole thing. You were right for what it's worth. She'd shorted the delivery count. Elena almost laughed. I know I was right. She looked at the journal. You wrote that I read like your sister. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. This one had weight to it. She read everything she could get her hands on, he said. She used to say, he stopped. She said that a story was the only kind of room that nobody could lock you out of. He looked at the table. She was 14 when they took her. She'd been reading since she was 5. She taught herself mostly, because I was useless at it until she made me practice with her. She taught you to read? Better than I already could. Something that might have been fondness, worn smooth by grief and time. She had opinions about how I held the book, about pacing. She'd tap the table if I went too fast over a word I clearly didn't understand. Elena was quiet for a moment. You went into the Eastern Seam for her. He looked up. Not just for me, she said. For her. Because you couldn't get her out, and so you got someone else out. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was already in the journals, in the 4 visits to Red Hollow, in the 14 months of dangerous work, in the $200 in gold coin that he'd set on the administrator's table without hesitation. She put her hand flat on the table, not reaching for him, just putting it there. A gesture that said, "I see this. I see what it is." "I'm not her," she said. "I know that. I know you're not." His voice had gone rough around the edges. "I never thought. I wasn't trying to. I know that too." She kept her voice level. "I'm just saying it so you know I know it. You're not confusing me with her. And what you did—" She stopped, trying to find words that were true without being too much. "What you did is the most human thing anyone has ever done for me, even with everything complicated underneath it. Maybe because of everything complicated underneath it." He looked at her hand on the table. He looked at his own hands, rough and scarred, resting on either side of the journal. "She would have been furious with me," he said, and there was something in his voice that was grief and love so tangled up they'd become inseparable. "For the mine, the risk. She'd have given me a full lecture about—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "She'd have wanted to meet you." "I think I'd have liked to meet her," Elena said. He nodded once, not trusting his voice. They sat like that for a while. The fire was low and needed tending, and neither of them moved to tend it, sitting in the cooling room with the weight of spoken things settling around them like dust after a disturbance, slowly finding its level. Finally, Elena got up and put a log on the fire. The practical thing. Always the practical thing, when the feeling was too big for the moment. "The eastern seam," she said from the fireplace. "Are you going back to it?" No. She turned. He was still at the table, but he'd moved the journal aside. "Why not? If there's still gold—" "Because I got what I needed from it." He said it simply, without drama. "And because it's not worth dying in." She thought about this. "You thought it was worth it before." Before, the math was different. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she let it sit. She came back to the table and poured them both coffee from the pot she'd made that morning, which was well past hot now, but still drinkable. She put his cup in front of him and sat back down. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You generally do." "That first night, when you told me I could take the key," she wrapped her hands around her cup. "Did you mean it? Or were you testing whether I'd trust you?" He frowned. "What would I learn from that?" "I don't know. Some people do it." "I meant it," he said. "I told you what I meant. I wasn't—" He seemed genuinely bothered by the suggestion. "That's not how I operate." "I know," she said. "I know that now. I didn't know it then." "Fair enough." He drank his coffee. "Did you take it, the key? Every night for 3 weeks. Do you still?" She considered lying, decided against it. "Sometimes. When the bad dreams come before I sleep." She looked at her cup. "It helps to know the latch is mine." He nodded slowly. "Then take it as long as you need to." "I might not need to much longer," she said, and heard how that sounded and looked up. He was looking at her steadily, not reading into it, not making it into something it wasn't, just looking and waiting to see if she had more to say. She did not have more to say. She looked back down at her coffee, but the thing she hadn't said hung in the air between them, visible and fine, like the steam coming off the cup, and neither of them moved to dispel it. The following week brought cold that was different in quality from the cold before it, drier and sharper, the kind that cracked the skin at the knuckles and made the trees snap at night like rifle shots. Rowan moved the extra blanket from the cedar chest up to the loft without being asked, which she chose not to comment on. She started going to bed with the key out of habit, but stopped lifting it from the shelf, and one morning realized she hadn't picked it up in 4 days. She put it in her coat pocket instead of putting it back on the shelf, which felt like a reasonable middle ground. He'd begun talking more. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the gradual increase of someone who was remembering that conversation was possible, that you could say a thing to another person, and they'd say a thing back, and the exchange itself was worth having. He talked about the valley, about the first winter he'd spent in it, about the tools he'd made and the ones he'd brought up from town, and which ones had lasted and which hadn't. He talked about the animals. There was a family of deer that used the south meadow in the mornings, and a fox he'd been seeing around the barn for the past 2 years that he'd been feeding scraps to against his own better judgment. "You named it," Elena said. She could tell by the way he'd mentioned the fox 3 times in as many days.
I didn't name it. What do you call it when you see it? A pause. Rust, he said. That's a name. It's a description. She let it go, smiling at her book.
She talked more too. She found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone, not because she'd decided to, but because the cabin had a quality of privacy that made things feel sayable. She told him about the Holloway girl, Ada, who had been her one real friend there, who'd been placed out at 14 to a farming family up north and had written Elena 2 letters before the letters stopped. She told him about the book she'd found in the Holloway library, the one with the broken spine that was still in her bag, a collection of short stories by a man she'd never heard of, about people living in the American West before everything got settled down into towns and commerce and platform auctions. She told him she'd read it so many times the pages had gone soft.
Which story? He asked. What? Which one's your favorite? She considered. The one about the woman who walks 600 miles to find her husband, and when she finds him, he's built a whole life without her, and she has to decide what to do with that. She paused. She turns around and walks back. She goes home. Except home is now just the direction she came from. He was quiet for a moment. That's a hard story. It's true, though. That kind of thing happened. The walking or the deciding? Both, she said, but mostly the deciding. Knowing when the thing you went looking for isn't what you find, and having the sense to understand the difference. He looked at her across the table. What do you think she was walking back to? Herself, maybe. She shrugged. Some version of herself that hadn't spent everything on looking for someone else. He was quiet again, in the way of someone turning an idea over, looking at its underside. You've done a lot of thinking for someone who has never given much time for it. The words landed simply, without ornamentation, and she felt them somewhere under her sternum. I had the nights, she said. Nights were mine. That's something. It was everything, some years. He reached across the table, not toward her, but to move the lamp slightly, adjusting the angle of the light. But his hand passed close enough to hers that she felt the warmth of it, and he left the lamp where it was for a moment before pulling his hand back. She noticed. She noticed and said nothing. The thing between them was becoming harder to not name. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather changing, not in any single observable moment, but in the accumulated evidence of smaller things. The way he tracked her when she moved around the cabin, not invasively, but the way your eyes go to things you can't quite stop looking at. The way she'd started falling asleep faster since the journals, since the conversation, since the morning he'd put the extra blanket in the loft and come back downstairs and made breakfast without mentioning it. The way the silences had changed again, had gotten a new texture, warmer and more complicated. She thought about it most when she was at the stream, which had become her thinking place, the one piece of space in the valley she considered fully hers. She'd go there in the late mornings when the light was best, sometimes with the book from her bag, sometimes with nothing, and stand or sit at the edge of the unfrozen section and think through whatever needed thinking. She thought about how she had spent 11 years not trusting anyone further than she could see them, and how trust had seemed like the kind of thing that happened to other people, to people who had families, who had someone watching their back, who didn't have to calculate constantly whether the next situation would be worse than the current one. She had thought of trust as a luxury, as the emotional equivalent of a warm house and a full plate, something you needed to already have some of before you could get more. Rowan had not asked for her trust. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He had just acted in ways that merited it, over and over, quietly and without fanfare. And trust had accumulated the way the woodpile accumulated, one piece at a time, until you looked at it and realized it was something substantial. She didn't know what to do with substantial. She had never had to figure that out before. She went back to the cabin one afternoon to find him at the wood carving, the piece he'd been working on when she first arrived. She'd seen it a few times in the weeks since. It was coming into shape, but she hadn't been able to tell yet what it was supposed to be. She sat across from him and watched his hands for a while, the careful movement of the small knife, the way he blew the shavings clear. "What is it?" she asked. He turned it and held it up. A bird, she thought. The wings were almost defined, the head finding its shape. "Wren," he said. "Or it's going to be." "Why a wren?" "They're louder than they have any right to be," he said, "for how small they are." He looked at the carving, then at her. Margaret's favorite bird. She looked at the wren taking shape in his hands, at the scars across his knuckles, at the careful, unrusty tenderness with which he held a piece of wood and tried to make it into something that mattered. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know, something simpler." He set the carving down. "That a complaint?" "No." She held his gaze. "Definitely not."
The lamp between them burned steady and low, and outside the wind had gone quiet for once, and the valley was holding its breath the way it sometimes did in the deep part of a winter evening. And Elena Cross sat across from Rowan Blackthorne and felt the thing she hadn't named pressing up against the inside of her chest, looking for a word. She did not give it one yet, but she stopped pretending she didn't feel it. That night she climbed the ladder to the loft and lay down and looked at the small window above her, the stars burning hard and clear in the black sky, and put her hand over her chest where the feeling was, and left it there, and let herself feel it without trying to manage it or reduce it to something more sensible. She had been managed and reduced for most of her life. She was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to take up more space than that. Below her the cabin was quiet. The fire was burning. The wren sat unfinished on the table, taking shape one careful cut at a time, and the night held everything in it gently, the way that only cold and dark and stars can, without asking anything in return. The first sign was rust. The fox had been coming around the barn every evening for 2 years, reliable as the dark, and Rowan had been feeding it scraps against his better judgment for most of that time. Elena had started leaving bits of salt pork near the barn door herself, which Rowan pretended not to notice, and she pretended was not a deliberate thing. On the morning the trouble came, Rust did not appear. Elena noticed it first, at breakfast. The way she'd gotten good at noticing small changes in the valley's patterns. The deer family that used the south meadow, the particular ravens that called from the eastern ridge, the fox that came at dusk without fail. She mentioned it to Rowan the way she mentioned most things, casually, without making it into more than it was. Rust didn't come last night. Rowan looked up from his coffee. Something shifted in his face, subtle, the kind of thing she would have missed 6 weeks ago and didn't miss now. "You're sure?" he said. "I left the scraps at 7. They were still there this morning." He set his cup down. He went to the window that faced the pass, to the narrow gap between the ridges through which the only real trail down to the valley ran, and stood there looking out at the snow-covered slope for a long moment without saying anything. "Rowan, animals run when something larger moves through their territory," he said, still looking out the window. "Predator, or something that smells like trouble to them. It's probably just, maybe." He turned from the window. He went to the peg by the door and took down his coat. "Stay inside today." "Why?" "Because I asked you to." He was pulling on his boots, moving with a purpose that was different from his usual purposeful movements, tighter, more controlled. "I'm going to check the pass." "You're going to check the pass alone," she said. "Yes." "Because you think someone's up there." He looked at her. "I think it's worth checking." She stood up from the table. "You said the men who've come through have never caused serious trouble." "I said we haven't had trouble in a while." The distinction landed the way distinctions do when they reframe something you thought you understood. She looked at his face, at the set of his jaw, at the way his hand had gone without conscious gesture to the place under his coat where the revolver hung. "How bad could it be?" she asked. He was quiet for a beat too long. "Rowan, how bad?" "There's a man named Cord Dillard," he said. He said it the way you say a thing you've been carrying for a while, not reluctantly, but with the particular flatness of something stated rather than confessed. "He was at the auction in Red Hollow." She went still. "The man in the buffalo coat?" "Yes." "He followed us." "I don't know yet. I'm going to find out." He finished with his boots and straightened up. "Dillard's not a smart man, but he's persistent and he knows how to find people. He's been running with a group out of the southern territories for the past few years. Hired guns, mostly. Men who'll work for whoever's paying." He looked at her directly. "He thinks there's gold here." "Is there?" "Not much. I moved most of what I had to the Territorial Bank in Harding last spring. There's maybe $40 in the cabin." He paused. "He doesn't know that." She absorbed this. "So he'll come for something that isn't here."
Men like Dillard don't go home empty-handed if they can help it. His voice was steady, informational, and entirely too calm. They find something else to take. The something else was understood between them without being named. Then I'm not staying inside while you go up the pass alone, she said. Elena, don't. She was already reaching for her own coat. Don't use that voice like I'm being unreasonable. You told me I was free to make my own choices. I'm making one. He looked at her. She looked back. You'll do exactly what I tell you up there, he said finally. No arguments in the moment. If I say get down, you get down. If I say run, you run. Agreed. I mean it. So do I.
He handed her the extra pair of gloves from the peg without further comment. They went out together into a morning that looked perfectly ordinary. Blue sky, brilliant snow, the kind of winter day that seemed to have no capacity for the kind of thing it turned out to be carrying. Grit moved in the barn, hearing them, and Rowan stopped and looked at the barn door for a moment. Take Grit to the back of the barn, he said quietly, the far stall. If anything happens, he'll panic in the front. She did it without argument while he checked the pass-side tree line through the field glasses he'd taken from the hook inside the door. She settled Grit in the rear stall, talking to him low and steady the way she'd learned he responded to, and came back to find Rowan lowering the glasses. His face told her what he'd seen before he said it. 4 of them, he said. Maybe 5. Coming down through the tree line above the pass. They're moving slow, trying to be quiet about it. How long? 20 minutes, maybe less. 20 minutes. She looked at the cabin, the barn, the open meadow between them and the pass. The valley that had seemed for 6 weeks like the safest place she'd ever been now showed her a different face, wide open, exposed, the single trail and also the single trail out. What do we do? She said. He was already moving back toward the cabin. We don't meet them in the open. Inside, I know every angle. The walls are solid, a foot of log, they're not shooting through that. He pushed the door open and she followed. There's a rifle above the door and another in the back room under the cot. Loaded. You know how to shoot? Somewhat. Somewhat isn't confidence-inspiring right now. I know how to pull a trigger and I know which end to point, she said. Beyond that, you'll have to work with what you've got. He looked at her for 1 second. Then, get the rifle from the back room. Don't fire it unless something comes through the back window or the side door. That's your angle. Mine is the front. She went for the rifle. It was heavier than she'd expected. A Winchester, old but clean, and she could tell from how it handled that he maintained it the way he maintained everything in the cabin, with the reliability of a person who understood that the difference between working and not working could matter. She checked it the way she'd seen the older boys at Holloway check weapons, cycling the action, making sure it was ready. When she came back to the main room, Rowan had moved the table against the far wall and was shuttering the front windows, heavy wood shutters she'd never seen closed before, with narrow slits cut through them for visibility. He worked fast and without wasted motion, and she understood that he had thought through this possibility before. Maybe not this specific situation, but a situation like it. The cabin had been built by someone who understood that remoteness was not the same as safety. There's a bar for the front door, he said, pointing. Iron bar, against the wall there. Get it in place. She found the bar, heavy, black iron, and slotted it through the brackets on either side of the door. It fit with the snug certainty of something purpose-made. They'll try to talk first, Rowan said. He was at the front window slit, watching the approach. Men like Dillard usually do. They like to give themselves the option of getting what they want without the mess. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who'd dealt with this particular variety of human before. Don't respond to anything they say through the wall. Let me handle the talking. And if talking doesn't work, then it doesn't work. He stepped back from the window. Elena, listen to me. She looked at him. I've been in tighter situations than this, he said. These men are greedy, and they're not from here. That matters. The cold works against them. The terrain works against them. And they think this is a quick job. His eyes held hers. It's not a quick job. She held the rifle and looked at his face and understood that he was not telling her this to comfort her. He was telling her this because it was a genuine tactical assessment, and he expected her to hold it and use it. All right, she said. He turned back to the window. They came out of the tree line 6 minutes later, which was faster than the 20 minutes he'd estimated, which meant they'd been closer than the field glasses suggested. 5 of them. She counted through the window slit beside the fireplace, the one that looked to the south. 5 men in heavy coats, moving across the meadow in a loose spread that was either tactical thinking or just men who didn't like walking single file. Cord Dillard was in front. She recognized the buffalo coat even from this distance, the heavy-set build, the walk of a man who'd never once considered that he might not get what he was after. They stopped about 30 yards from the cabin door. Dillard looked at the shuttered windows, looked at the barred door, and the calculation on his face was visible even from here. Blackthorn. His voice carried well in the cold air. Come on out. We just want to talk. Rowan said nothing. He was at the front window, watching. We know you're in there. Saw the smoke from the pass. Dillard waited. Nobody needs to get hurt today. We heard you've got gold up here. Man alone doesn't need much. We'll take what you can spare and move on. The word alone snagged in Elena's chest. He didn't know she was here, or he knew and was choosing not to acknowledge it, which was its own kind of message. Rowan still said nothing. Dillard's voice changed, still loud enough to carry, but with an edge under it now, like a blade coming through fabric. Don't be stupid about this, mountain man. There's 5 of us. We can wait you out, or we can come in. You pick which way it goes. Rowan moved from the window to the door. He lifted the bar slightly, just enough to crack the door open an inch, not enough to expose himself. The gold's in the Territorial Bank in Harding, he said. His voice came out level and carried like a stone thrown flat across water. Has been since spring. You rode up here for nothing. Silence from the meadow. That's a lie, Dillard said, but his voice had acquired a note of uncertainty. It's the truth. $40 in the cabin. Take it and go, and nobody has a bad day. More silence. She could see through her window slit that Dillard was talking to the men beside him in low, urgent tones. One of them, younger, edgy-looking, with a rifle he was holding too tight, kept glancing at the tree line like he was thinking about options. Can't go back empty, Dillard said finally. You understand that. That's a personal problem, Rowan said. The shot came from the left flank. Not Dillard, one of the others, and it was more a warning shot than an aimed one, splintering the edge of the doorframe 6 inches from where Rowan had been standing. He was already back and away from the door, letting it fall shut, slamming the bar down. Then it was loud and fast, and nothing like what Elena had spent the previous 10 minutes bracing for, which had been something more ordered, more deliberate. Instead, it was chaos. Gunshots from at least 3 different directions, the sound of them shockingly violent in the cold quiet of the valley, and from somewhere close came the sound of Grit screaming in the barn, that awful horse panic sound. And then someone was at the side door. Back left, Rowan said, not shouting, just projecting. And she was already moving. The side door was a smaller door she used to access the woodshed without going outside, and someone was hitting it hard, not with a body but with something metal, trying to knock the latch loose. The latch was a simple hook and eye, not strong, and she could see it jumping with each impact. She had the rifle. She got to the side of the door, not in front of it, and her hands were not shaking, which surprised her. Later she would think about why they weren't shaking and decide it was because there was no room for shaking. The situation had a terrible clarity to it, a simplicity that overrode the fear, which was still there but had compressed itself into a small, hard thing in her chest that was not running the show. Get away from that door, she said. She said it loud and level. The hitting stopped. Then, there's a woman in there? A younger voice, surprised. There's someone with a rifle in here, she said. That's what matters. Back away from the door. From the front of the cabin, she heard Rowan's rifle fire once, and then a shout from outside that was not a death sound, but a pain sound. Someone hit, but not killed. More shots followed, a rapid exchange, and then a pause. The cabin filled with the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder. Elena, Rowan's voice, controlled but urgent. Side door's clear, she called back. Stay on it. The man outside the side door had not left. She could hear him breathing, hear his boots in the snow, the shuffle of someone regrouping, and then the latch gave. The door swung inward and she was already braced, the rifle up, and the man in the doorway saw the barrel pointed at his face and stopped with 1 foot inside and 1 foot out, which was not a position anyone could hold for long. He was younger than she'd expected.
25 at most, with a patchy beard and eyes that were doing something complicated, trying to be threatening and failing because the rifle was very close to his face. "Drop it," she said. He had a revolver. His hand was shaking in a way hers was not. I said, "Drop it." He dropped it. It fell into the snow just outside the door with a muffled sound. "Step back," she said, "all the way back, against the woodshed wall." He stepped back. She watched him go, keeping the rifle up, and when he was against the wall, she pulled the door and threw the latch, knowing the latch was broken and it would hold for approximately nothing, and turned. In the front of the cabin, through the window slit, she could see the meadow. 2 of the 5 men were retreating toward the tree line. One was down in the snow, moving, not dead. Dillard was still standing, and he was not retreating. He had something in his hand that wasn't a gun. It took her a half second to understand what she was seeing. A bottle, a rag in the neck of it, and a match. "Rowan," she said, "he's going to—" The front window shutter exploded inward. Not from the burning bottle, from a shot, from one of the retreating men who'd apparently decided the retreat wasn't final, and the shot came through the slit at exactly the wrong moment, and Rowan was there at exactly the wrong moment, and she heard the sound of him hitting the floor. She did not think. That was the honest truth of what happened next. She did not think, because if she had thought, she would have cataloged all the reasons what she was about to do was not a reasonable decision, and she would have been right about all of them, and she would have stayed inside while the cabin burned. She unbarred the front door and went out. The cold hit her like a wall. She had no coat. She'd dropped it when she'd gone for the rifle. The snow was shin-deep off the beaten path, and she went through it toward the woodshed, toward the long-handled splitting maul she had seen every morning for 6 weeks leaning against the woodshed wall because Rowan never put it inside after he used it, which was a habit she'd told him twice was sloppy and which she was now profoundly grateful for. Dillard had his back to her. He was focused on the cabin door, on the bottle in his hand, on the match he was trying to strike in the cold. Cold made matches difficult, she knew this, fingers numb, and the striker surface not cooperating, and he was cursing at it in a low, steady stream. She was 20 feet away, then 15. The snow muffled her footsteps, but not completely, and she was aware that any of the other men could see her from the tree line, that she was completely exposed, that this was in every technical sense a terrible plan. She got to 10 feet and Dillard heard her. He turned. His face did something complicated. Surprise, then contempt, then a reassessment as he registered the maul in her hands. "Girl," he said, like it was a complete sentence, like it was an answer to a question. "Put it down," she said. He looked at the maul. He looked at her. He was holding the unlit bottle in one hand and the match in the other, and he was calculating the way men like him calculated, quickly and poorly, factoring out the parts of the situation that didn't fit the story he'd already decided. "You're not going to do anything with that," he said. He reached for the striker. She swung, not at him. She'd had enough time in those 10 feet to realize that swinging the maul at a man was going to go badly wrong unless she hit him perfectly, and she was not confident she'd hit him perfectly. She swung at his hand, the hand holding the bottle. The head of the maul connected with his wrist with a sound that made her stomach turn. The bottle went sideways into the snow and did not break, which was the most important thing, and Dillard made a sound that was less a word than a shape of pain and grabbed his wrist and staggered back. She stepped on the bottle, pressed her foot down on it, and did not move her foot. For a moment, nothing happened. Dillard was bent over his wrist, breathing hard, and the meadow was almost quiet. The shooting had stopped, she registered distantly, and the 2 men at the tree line were very still. "It's over," she said. She was breathing hard. "Your man inside gave up, the one you left at the side door." She didn't know if that was exactly true, but it was close enough. "There is no gold here. There is nothing here for you. And you just tried to burn a man's home down, which means there are going to be lawmen looking for you, and you've got a broken wrist, and I think you should leave now." Dillard looked up at her. His face was contorted with pain and the particular humiliation of a man who has been stopped by someone he'd written off. "You're nothing," he said. It came out raw, the words of a man reaching for his familiar toolkit and finding it inadequate but using it anyway. "You're a girl nobody wanted." "I know what I am," she said, "and I know what you are. Go." He went. Not gracefully, not quickly, clutching his wrist and walking bent.
But he went, and the men at the tree line went with him, and the one in the snow got up and limped after them, and the meadow was quiet. She stood there for a moment with the maul in her hands and her feet in the snow and no coat on, and the cold was suddenly enormous. It came back all at once, the cold and the shaking that had been waiting, and her knees were not entirely reliable. She stood through it anyway. Then she went back inside. Rowan was not on the floor. He'd gotten himself up and was at the front window watching the tree line through the shutter slat, his left hand pressed against his right side. She crossed to him and pulled his hand away without asking permission and looked at what was underneath. A long graze along the ribs. The shot had caught him at the edge, not gone through, which was the only reason they were having this moment at all. It was bleeding steadily and in the way that needed attention, but it was not the kind of wound that ended things. She'd seen worse at Holloway, accidents and fights, and she'd been the one to deal with them because the administrator couldn't stand blood. "Sit down," she said. "I'm Rowan?" She met his eyes. "Sit down." He sat. She found the cloth she needed, the tin of pine tar he kept for the horse's hooves, but which worked in a pinch for sealing, the clean strips from the rag bag on the second shelf. She worked fast and steady, cleaning the wound while he sat still and breathed carefully, and neither of them spoke for a while. "You went out," he said finally. "Yes." "I told you if I said—" "You didn't say anything," she pointed out. "You were on the floor." He was quiet. "The maul was leaning against the woodshed," she said. "I told you twice that was a sloppy habit." Something moved in his face. Not quite the shape of a smile. It was too sore for that, but something in the territory of it. "You hit him." His wrist. The bottle went into the snow. And then I talked to him until he left. She tied off the bandage. The young one at the side door had already given up, dropped his gun in the snow. Rowan looked at his bandaged side. He looked at her hands, which were now resting in her lap, the shaking barely visible. He reached out and put his hand over both of hers, just rested it there, large and warm and heavy, and she felt the shaking slow. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm all right." She turned one hand over beneath his, not pulling away. "You need to stay still for a while." I know what you can do," she said. "I'm telling you what you're going to do." He closed his mouth. He looked at her hand turned up under his, her fingers that had been cold from no coat and were warming now. He looked at her face. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. "Both," she said. "It was definitely both." He didn't argue with that. He sat in the chair by the fire she'd rebuilt while she was bandaging him, his hand over hers, and the light was going down early the way it did in December in the mountains, and somewhere out in the valley, rust had come back. She could hear Grit's particular calm nicker that meant something familiar was near the barn, not the panic sound, but the ordinary sound. The fox was back. The trouble had passed. It had not passed cleanly or without damage. The side door latch needed fixing. The front shutter had a hole through it. Rowan had a wound that was going to hurt for weeks and would need watching for the fever that could come with such things. Her hands, when she finally looked at them in the lamplight, were scraped raw at the knuckles from the maul's grip in the cold, and she had not noticed until now. None of it was clean. None of it was the kind of thing you told as a story where everyone came through unscathed. It was what it was. A bad morning that could have gone much worse, and two people who had come through it still in possession of the things that mattered. She put a second log on the fire. She poured water for coffee. She sat back down and let him keep holding her hands, which he was still doing, and she did not move away. Outside, the last of the light left the sky, and the mountains went dark, and the valley went quiet, and somewhere near the barn a fox moved in the snow, and the stars came out hard and cold and countless, the way they always did up here, indifferent to everything below them, and somehow, in their indifference, constant. The lawmen came 3 days later. 2 deputies from the territorial office in Harding, riding up through the pass on horses that looked unhappy about the altitude and the cold. Elena heard them before she saw them. Grit's alert nicker from the barn, the sound of unfamiliar hooves on packed snow. And she was at the window with the rifle before she'd fully decided to be. Rowan put his hand on her arm from behind her. "Badges," he said quietly. "Left one's got a badge." She looked. He was right. She set the rifle down but didn't put it away.
The deputies were a study in contrast. The older one was heavy-set and deliberate, the kind of man who moved like he'd seen enough things that nothing surprised him anymore. And the younger one was maybe 22 and trying very hard to look like he wasn't nervous about being this far up a mountain in December. They stopped their horses in front of the cabin, and the older one called out in the particular way of lawmen, announcing themselves, loud and formal, and Rowan lifted the bar and went out to meet them. Elena stood in the doorway and watched. The conversation took 20 minutes. She caught pieces of it. Dillard's name, the names of two of the other men, apparently known to the territorial office for reasons predating their visit to this valley. The younger deputy took notes in a small book. Rowan showed them the shutter with the hole through it, the side door latch still broken, the bandage visible at his side when his coat shifted, though he didn't mention it directly. She saw the older deputy's eyes go to it, and then to her in the doorway, and he touched the brim of his hat in the old courtesy. Before they left, the older deputy reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Almost forgot," he said. "This came to the Harding office addressed to a Miss Elena Cross, care of Rowan Blackthorne. Figured we'd bring it up since we were making the trip anyway." Rowan took the envelope and looked at it for a moment before he came back inside. He held it out to her without a word. Her name was on the front in the formal hand of someone who wrote official correspondence for a living. The return seal was from the Territorial Department of Civil Records in Denver. Her hands were steady when she opened it. She'd gotten better at steady. The letter was 3 paragraphs and a lot of formal language, but the meaning of it was simple. The paperwork from the Red Hollow labor placement, cross-referenced with her age and prior institutional record, had been reviewed and formalized. Elena Ann Cross, age 19, was hereby recorded as a free individual with no outstanding placements, debts, or institutional obligations. A copy of her birth record, recovered from the Holloway Home's files, was enclosed. A copy of her birth record. She had not known one existed. She unfolded the second document. It was a single page, water-stained at one corner, but legible. Her name. Her parents' names. Thomas Cross and Mary Cross, née Halverson. A date. A county in Wyoming she'd never been to, or had been to as an infant and couldn't remember. She looked at her mother's name for a long time. Mary Cross, née Halverson. A woman she knew almost nothing about, reduced to a name on a page, and it was both more and less than she'd had this morning. "You all right?" Rowan said. He'd been quiet since handing her the envelope, waiting. "She was Mary Halverson before she was Mary Cross," Elena said. "I didn't know that." He said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and he'd gotten good at knowing the difference between silences that needed filling and silences that needed keeping. She folded both documents carefully and put them in the tin box in her bag. The one that had belonged to her mother, the one she'd carried from the Holloway home with nothing inside it because she'd had nothing to put in it. She had something now, small and incomplete and not enough, but something. "Free," she said, out loud, to herself as much as to him. "It says free." "Yes," he said. "It's a strange word. Most important ones are." She looked at him. He was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, the way he stood when his side was hurting, but he didn't want to draw attention to the fact that his side was hurting, which was always. The wound was healing. She'd been changing the dressing twice daily, watching for the red edges that would mean fever, and so far it had stayed clean. But healing was slow, and he was not, as it turned out, a patient man when it came to his own limitations. "You should sit down," she said. "I've been sitting down for 3 days." "You've been sitting down and also trying to fix the shutter with one functional arm, which is not the same thing as resting." He made a sound that was not quite an argument, but was close. "Sit down," she said, and went to put the kettle on. He sat down. It had become, she realized, a kind of language between them. This particular back and forth, the mild resistance and the mild insistence, and the outcome that was always the same. She told him to sit. He sat. He told her not to go out in the dark alone. She didn't. Small negotiations about care, about who was watching out for whom, about the mutual acknowledgement that neither of them was actually as fine as they tended to claim. She made tea and brought it to him and sat across the table, and for a while they just sat in the afternoon quiet of the cabin with the documents on the table between them. "She was Mary Halverson," Elena said again. She was still thinking about it. "My father was Thomas Cross. They were both dead before I was 9. She looked at the table. I used to try to remember her face. I can't anymore. I remember her hands, I think, and that she smelled like something, some kind of herb. I don't know which one. Lavender, maybe? Rowan said. A lot of women grew it. Maybe. She looked up at him. Do you remember your mother's face? Some days, he said. Less than I used to. He turned his cup in his hands. I remember her voice better than her face. She used to sing, working, not songs anyone would recognize, so she just made them up as she went, about whatever she was doing. Elena tried to imagine it. A woman in some other kitchen, in some other time, singing made-up songs about the dishes or the bread. A boy listening. A girl 6 years younger, learning to read. We both ended up carrying a lot of things alone, she said. Yes. That's not a criticism, she said quickly. I just meant it's a hard way to live. Getting used to being the only one who knows what you're carrying. He looked at her steadily. Getting unused to it isn't simple either. No, she agreed. It's not. She wrapped her hands around her cup. But I think it's worth the trouble. The fire popped between them. Outside, the snow was falling again, the third heavy snowfall in a week, and the valley was going white and soft and indistinct, the mountains at the far edges blurring into the low cloud. Inside the cabin, it was warm, the amber light of the lamp and the red glow of the fire mixing into something that had no good name but felt, to Elena, like the visual equivalent of the word home, which she was carefully and still a little suspiciously beginning to apply to this place. That evening, after dinner, she asked him something she'd been turning over for several days. When Dillard called me a girl nobody wanted, she said. She said it looking at the fire, not at him. I told him I know what I am. She paused. I believed it when I said it, but I'm not always sure what I know. She heard him set down his cup. I mean, I know I'm capable, she said. I know I can work, and I can think, and I can swing a splitting maul at a man's wrist in the snow without my hands shaking. She glanced at him. I know those things. But knowing what you're worth, actually believing it, not just knowing it as a fact, that's different. That's harder. She looked back at the fire. Some days I still wait to be told to leave. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, some days I still expect to find a letter saying Margaret died. She turned to look at him. I know she's gone, he said. I've known for years. But some mornings I come downstairs and I have this... He stopped. Half a second where I think I should write to her. Tell her what the valley looks like today. Tell her some stupid thing that happened. He looked at his hands. And then I remember. He was quiet. Knowing and believing aren't the same country. No, she said. They're not. What I know, he said, carefully, like a man finding his footing on uncertain ground, is that you went out into the snow with no coat and a splitting maul because you weren't willing to let it end badly, and that you talked a dangerous man into leaving on a broken wrist. He looked at her directly. And that you've been cleaning my wound and changing the dressing twice a day without being asked and without making me feel like an inconvenience about it. He paused. What I know is that this cabin is different since you came into it, and not because it's cleaner, though it is, because there's someone in it who notices things, who pays attention. She felt the words in that chest place, the one that had held the unnamed feeling for weeks now. Rowan, she said, you asked what you know, he said. I'm telling you what I know. You can do what you want with it. She looked at him for a long moment, at the scar along his jaw, at the dark eyes that looked back at her without condition or performance, at the hands that had carved a wren from a piece of wood because his dead sister had loved wrens, and that had held hers in the aftermath of a fight until the shaking stopped, and that were resting on the table now open and still. She reached across the table and put her hand in his, not the tentative gesture of someone testing, the full thing, deliberate and clear. His hand closed around hers and stayed there. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already in the gesture, in the fire between them and the snow outside, and the 5 weeks of small, accumulated truths that had been building toward this particular moment the way water builds behind a dam. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a pressure that was always going to find its way through. They sat like that for a while. The lamp burned. The snow fell.
Grit moved in the barn with the comfortable sounds of an animal that was warm and fed and untroubled. Eventually she said, "I'm going to stay." He didn't answer right away. Then, "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. "That's the point." Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, not the way faces shift in stories where the change is written large and legible. Just a slight release of something that had been held. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. The winter deepened. January came in hard and cold, the kind of cold that rendered the world simple and unforgiving, that reduced everything to the basics of heat and shelter and enough food and the people you were sharing those things with. Elena had expected the deep winter to be oppressive. She'd heard stories of mountain winters that drove people mad with the isolation, but found instead that it had a quality of enforced clarity she'd come to appreciate. You couldn't be too many things at once when it was this cold. You had to be present, careful, focused on the immediate. She and Rowan developed a life in the way that two people with practical natures develop a life together, through the accumulation of solved problems. The side door latch, fixed with a new iron hook he shaped himself at the small forge in the barn. The shutter, repaired and reinforced so the next one to try would have a harder time. The root cellar, reorganized so that what needed to come out first was where she could reach it without digging, which had been driving her quietly insane since November. She took over the accounts, the small ledger where he tracked supplies and costs and what the mining work had brought in. His system had been functional but chaotic, entries made whenever he remembered to make them, sometimes weeks apart. She brought it current and showed him the new arrangement, and he looked at it for a moment and said, without much ceremony, "That's better than what I had," which she had come to understand was his version of high praise. He taught her to shoot properly. Not in a single lesson, but over several weeks, out in the South Meadow, when the cold was bearable and the light was good, starting with stance and breathing and working forward from there. She was not a natural. She had a tendency to anticipate the recoil and pull slightly left. But she was consistent about practicing, and she improved, which he noted with the same brevity he noted most things. "You're not pulling left anymore," he said one morning, after she'd put 4 shots inside a pattern that would have satisfied anyone. "I know," she said. "Don't get smug about it." "I'm not smug. I'm accurate. There's a difference." He took the rifle from her and checked the action with the automatic ease of long habit. "You're a little smug. Only about this," she said. "I've earned it." He handed the rifle back. She saw the almost smile. She was collecting those now, cataloging them the way she cataloged everything. The slight change around his eyes, the way one corner of his mouth moved before he caught it. They were becoming more frequent, and she chose not to mention this in case mentioning it made them stop. The wren was finished in late January. She came in one morning from the barn to find it sitting on the table where the journals used to be. Complete. Wings slightly raised as if deciding whether to fly, head turned at that alert angle wrens had. He'd worked some kind of oil into the wood that brought out the grain, and it was small enough to sit in a palm, and it was by any honest measure beautiful. He wasn't in the cabin. She picked it up and held it and felt the weight of it, heavier than it looked, dense wood, and thought about the dead girl who had loved this bird, and about the living man who had spent months carving it, and about the strange, circuitous path that had brought her to this cabin and this moment, holding a small wooden wren in a mountain valley in the deep of winter. She set it back carefully and went to find Rowan in the barn. "It's done," she said. He was brushing grit, not looking at her. "Needed one more pass on the tail feathers." "It's done," she said again. "It's good, Rowan." He kept brushing. "She would have put it on a windowsill," he said. "She always put things where the light could get at them." "Then that's where it'll go." He stopped brushing. He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She gave him back the words he'd given her. "That's the point." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Grief and gratitude and something that was neither or was both at once. The complicated feeling of being seen in a place you'd kept private for a long time and finding, unexpectedly, that it didn't hurt the way you'd thought it would. "The south window gets the most light," he said finally. "Then the south window," she said. The wren went to the south window. It sat there through February and into March, and the light came through in the afternoons and moved across it, and sometimes she'd look up from whatever she was doing to find him looking at it too. And they didn't speak about it, but it was there, and the being there of it was enough. February brought a storm that penned them in for 11 days. 11 days of snow and wind, and the cabin reduced to its essential self: fire, food, 2 people, and the long hours of being very close in a small space without anywhere to retreat to. She had expected it to be difficult. It wasn't, or not in the way she'd expected. He was underfoot and occasionally in her way, and once left a wet coat draped over the chair she'd been about to sit in, which led to an argument that was shorter and less heated than arguments of that kind usually were, and which ended with him moving the coat and her making coffee, and both of them sitting down and reading without further incident. "You're easier to argue with than I thought," she said that evening. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't dig in," she said. "You disagree, but you don't make it into a fight about more than what it's about." He thought about this. "That's because I'm usually wrong about the small things." "You're not always wrong." "Often enough." He turned a page. The coat was a fair complaint. She smiled at her book. He saw it. She knew he saw it. On the 9th day of the storm, somewhere in the long middle of an afternoon that felt like it might last forever, he said, out of what seemed like nowhere, "I want to show you something when the snow clears." She looked up. "What?" "The eastern seam," he said. "The mine." She went still. "Why?" "Because you should see it." He was looking at his book but not reading it. "You should see where the gold came from. It seems like something you should know." She looked at him, at the side of his face, the jaw, the scar. "All right," she said. He nodded and went back to his book, or pretended to. She looked back at her own book and thought about a man alone in a dangerous mine, in bad air and rotten rock for 14 months, pulling gold out of the dark because he'd seen a girl look at the mountains like she was memorizing them. She thought about the kind of loneliness that produces that kind of action. Not the self-pitying kind, but the deep, quiet kind. The kind that has been carried so long it doesn't feel like loneliness anymore, just like the shape of things. She thought about her own loneliness, 11 years of it, the specific hollowness of a life lived in institutions, of being processed and placed and moved and never once asked what she wanted. She thought about what it meant that neither of them was lonely anymore. The storm broke on the 11th day, and the valley emerged into a stillness so complete it was almost loud. That particular post-storm quiet of a world that has been covered and muffled and is now just sitting under the weight of its own snow, catching its breath. Rowan's wound had healed enough that he moved without the careful guard he'd been keeping around his right side since December. She checked it one last time the morning after the storm and declared it done, which was perhaps premature but not irresponsible, and he accepted the declaration with the relief of a man who had been very tired of having his side fussed over. They went to the eastern seam on a morning in early March when the light was back and the air had a cold clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch. She followed him up the steep slope above the valley's eastern edge, through the pine forest, and above the tree line, and into the bare rock country, where the trail was mostly in his memory and only partly visible in the snow. The mine entrance was unimpressive. A dark gap in the rock face, shored with timber that had been placed with care, a wooden platform in front still half buried in snow. She'd been expecting something larger. "This is it?" she said. "This is it." He stopped at the platform's edge, looking into the dark. The seam runs about 60 feet in and then branches. The right branch is where most of the gold was. He paused. "The left branch is where the rock is rotten. I went in there twice before I learned better." She looked into the dark. She thought about him in there, alone, in bad air, in rock that could come down without warning. "You could have died in there," she said. "Several times, probably." He said it without drama, just the plain accounting of a man who'd accepted the terms of a thing he'd decided to do. "I knew that when I started." "And you did it anyway." "Yes." She looked at the dark entrance for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Was it worth it?" He looked at her. Not at the mine, not at the mountain. At her, directly and without evasion, the way he'd looked at her from the edge of the crowd in Red Hollow on the worst morning of her life. "Yes," he said. Simply, completely, without question. She held his gaze and felt the word land in all the places it needed to land. She did not say what she was feeling. She didn't need to.
It was already in the way she was standing next to him on a platform in the snow above a valley that was hers now, or was becoming hers, or had been hers since the 7th day when she'd realized she'd stopped counting the days. She turned and looked out at the valley below them, the cabin with its smoke rising thin and straight in the cold air, the barn, the meadow, the stream catching the morning light, the whole small world of it. Not large, not grand, not the kind of place that appeared in anyone's imagination when they thought about what freedom looked like, but real, solid, hers. They walked back down together, carefully on the icy sections, and she slipped once on a patch of hard ice, and his hand came out and caught her arm, and she caught his, and they stood for a moment, balanced against each other on the slope, before she found her footing again. Neither of them let go immediately. They kept walking, her hand tucked inside his arm, down through the snow and the pine trees and back into the valley, where grit nickered from the barn, and Rust was probably nosing around the woodshed for scraps. In the south window of the cabin, the wooden wren sat where they'd put it, catching the light. Below it, on the sill, Elena had placed the tin box, the one that had belonged to her mother, that had traveled with her from placement to placement for 11 years with nothing inside it, that now held a birth record with the name Mary Halverson written on it. She didn't know if she'd ever find out more about the woman who'd carried that name. Probably not much more. The trail was too old, too broken. But the name itself was something. A place to put a hand and feel ground. She thought sometimes about what the story of her life looked like from the outside. The girl on the platform, the stranger in the crowd, the mountain and the mine, and the journals, and the mall, and the slow, imperfect, unguaranteed process of two damaged people learning to take up space in each other's lives, without damage being the main thing they were to each other. It wasn't a clean story. None of the real ones were. The real ones had broken latches and headaches and arguments about wet coats and wounds that needed watching for fever and hands that shook after the crisis passed instead of during it, because during it, you were too busy to shake. The real ones had grief that didn't resolve, just changed shape. A dead girl who would have put the wren where the light could get at it, who was not gone entirely, who lived in the carving and in the way a man's voice changed when he said her name. The real ones had a box that had been empty for 11 years and was now less empty. That was enough. More than enough. It was the whole thing, in fact. The whole difficult, unfinished, ongoing thing. And Elena Cross, who had been the last one on the platform, who had been the girl nobody wanted, who had turned and followed a stranger into the mountains with no good reason except that staying felt worse than going, stood in the doorway of a cabin that was hers, and looked out at the valley that was hers, and felt, without apology, that she had earned every inch of it. The light moved across the snow. The mountains held their ground. Somewhere behind her, Rowan was doing something at the work table, some practical thing, and the sound of it was ordinary and domestic and real.
What does that mean?
She stayed in the doorway a moment longer, breathing the cold air in and out. Then she came inside and closed the door against the cold, and that was that.
Come on.
Gonna do it.
Come on, Lee. Alright, we lose soul. The smolder got caught. Why has been complaining about Gallia chunking him, bro? It's full AP.
Because he has a fucking bajillion health, and he's like, catching him, so annoying. I'm the one who says that.
Blank is so balanced. This game is dog shit. This is boring.
He's going full AP though, yeah, and he has fucking like 3k health.